It's round 10 of the Tata Steel tournament and real drama today. I'm going to take you through the game between the number 1 and number 2 players in the world, Magnus Carlsen against Fabiano Caruana. And I also want to show you a couple of beautiful finishes from other games as well. Don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe, and do consider supporting us via PayPal or Patreon. Right, on with this game. So Caruana with the white pieces playing really well in the tournament so far. Magnus Carlsen struggling for form. Caruana played g3 Catalan, and here, well, rather surprisingly, Carlsen thought for almost 13 minutes before making his move. Rather unexpected on move 3, but he said after the game that he wasn't expecting the Catalan. Well, that much was obvious, but he said, I sort of regretted on other days not thinking in the opening because I played my preparation and then ended up not liking my position. So I thought this time, let me think from the start and just try to get a game. Well, that's wise. You know, sometimes we can play just by rote and, it somehow doesn't end up so well. So Carlsen plays bishop b4 check, and this variation has a good reputation. And the main move here is bishop b7, so it's a kind of closed variation of the Catalan. But he played this move bishop d6, which is a side variation, and I think this is very interesting. Ding Liren has played this quite a bit. I recommended this on my repertoire for Black Against the Catalan, my DVD for ChessBase, available at the ChessBase online store. I like this. I think it's a little bit different. Basically, Black is aiming to get a kind of stonewall position with knight e4 and f5, where the bishop obviously is well placed on d6. So that's why Caruana played the knight c3, preventing, to some extent, knight e4. And then he played bishop g5. And this is quite a solid way of playing the position. Basically, white is aiming to get in e4. The downside is that you have to give up the two bishops in playing like this. And now Caruana played queen b3. Castles has a better reputation actually, but anyway, queen b3 is not bad. It felt like both players were kind of feeling their way through this opening. Caruana thought for 13 minutes over this move. And now castles. And here, well, the move that I quite like is simply to exchange on c4 and then play queen e7. So that avoids knight e4, and if white plays e4, then you play e5, and well, white has a little bit more space, but I think with the two bishops, black should be fine in this position. There's sometimes a chance to attack white's queen and gain time. But Carlsen played, after again quite a long think, queen e7. So again, nudging the queen backwards. The only thing is that in this position, white can close things to a certain extent and then play e4. So the idea is that if black takes, then you can see that pawn rather cramps black's queen side. Carlsen played b6. Now, he doesn't have to play that. After the game, he said that he'd missed about 3 different things in this position. Quite possibly queen a4 is white's best move here, and it's a little bit awkward how black defends that pawn. But anyway, Caruana took here and then attacked the queen, which certainly doesn't look bad. But here, well, Magnus overlooked something again. He should probably just put the queen back to d8. And then, well, Caruana has to decide what to do about the pawn on c5. And, well, if he has to exchange here, then that must be absolutely fine for black. Even though black's a little bit cramped for the moment with the two bishops, it should be all right. But instead, Carlsen played queen f6, and he'd obviously overlooked Caruana's next move, which shows Magnus isn't quite there at the moment. He overlooked knight takes d5. After pawn takes knight, queen takes, you can see the rook is attacked. And after rook b8, c6 traps the knight on d7. It's a very unusual tactic with so many pieces on the board, but the knight doesn't have a good square to go to. So Carlsen just had to play rook d8. So Caruana took back the knight, but, well, somehow by chance, actually, those exchanges have given black a pretty harmonious position. Yes, Carlsen's a pawn down, but actually the rooks are connected. The bishops, once those pawns have cleared out of the way, actually look quite nice. It's actually quite a decent position. I think the best chance for white here is to play rook c1. And white is still better here, there's no doubt about that. Caruana played knight e5, which at first glance looks very logical. Playing the knight to the outpost, hits the bishop, looks at c6 as well. But Carlsen's reply was very simple and very clear. Bishop e6. So the bishop is on a good square, and he simply exchanged off one of his bishops for the knight and put the queen back. The problem for white in this position is that this bishop is actually a superb piece, and the Catalan bishop, which so often is such a strong piece, actually isn't hitting anything here. This bishop, on the other hand, is on a really important diagonal, looking at the pawn on a2, so at some moment white is going to have to decide what to do about that, whether to play a3 or b3. Black already has a rook on the open file. The queen is a little bit vulnerable on e4. You know, bishop d5 can come here. So Caruana put it back on e3. And after this, well, you can see, yeah, the bishop looks at a2. The rooks have hit the open files quicker than white. And basically, even though black is a clear pawn down here, this is already absolutely fine for black. If a3 or b3 here, you've got to watch the rook coming to c2 straight away. Or potentially the queen coming to b4, or the advance of the a-pawn in some positions. Well, Caruana played bishop e4. Understandable. Covers the c2 square and prevents the rook's invasion. Now, again, a very simple move from Carlsen. Just offering an exchange of queens. And, well, at some moment, white is going to have to defend that. Of course, at the moment, there's no real threat because of a discovered check. But nevertheless, f4 is going to have to come at some moment. Otherwise, black will play g5 potentially just to surround that pawn. So f4 and g6. This pawn majority actually isn't going anywhere. Those squares are beautifully controlled by the bishop. That bishop is an absolute monster on e6. So because white has no counterplay on the king side, then black can play with a free hand. And yeah, it's not really possible to challenge rooks. You've got to watch out for this one. Not to mention the a-pawn being loose. So the king came to e3 to at least cover the d2 square, but now a4. If one of those pawns on the queen side disappears, then these pawns can be really potent. So it's curious. Caruana has to be very careful here. And now, good move. Instead of trading down, rook b5 keeps up the pressure. Rook c2, rook b4, watch out. Rook takes bishop, and bishop f5 check with a nice skewer is threatened. So bishop d3. And now, very cool move from Magnus. h5. Now, I think that's simply an indication that white really doesn't have a very useful move in this position. h5 wasn't strictly necessary, but it just kind of emphasizes the control that black has over these squares. Rook d2 played. b5. Nice and steady. So at some moment, well, white has to free the rook. So a3, but then rook b3. Great position. And a very nasty pin. Caruana has to be very careful here. Rook c1. Well, he did this because basically he realized that it was time to liquidate to a draw. And this kind of forces matters. The threat is rook c3, and that will break that pin. So Carlsen has to react. b4. That has to be taken. And rook takes b4 is okay, but a3 actually forces a draw. So that has to be taken. Bishop f5 threatens to win the bishop. Nasty pins. Rook d1. Rook takes a3. Let's get one of the pawns back. So obviously white is completely tied to defending the bishop. b5 from Caruana. Bishop g4 pushes this rook out of the way, but the bishop just comes back, threatening the bishop. The rook has to come back to defend. Bishop g4, and the players simply repeated moves, and that's a forced draw. So there we go. I think an intriguing battle. Carlsen obviously not quite there at the moment. You know, he admitted that b6, after b6, he overlooked several possibilities for black and indeed overlooked this tactic which won a pawn, but he found a very convincing way to actually get compensation, and turns out this position isn't so bad for black at all. That draw meant that Fabiano Caruana went up to 6.5 points. But very interesting, Alireza Firouzja, he drew, so that meant he was on 6.5. Sipenko won a really nice game against David Anton. Let me just show you the end of that game. This was wonderful. So Sipenko with white. He's got a really strong pass pawn on c6. It's blockaded, but I mean obviously white is doing extremely well with that wonderful bishop controlling, protecting the pawn, but also looking at f7. But now Sipenko found a really beautiful way to finish. It's kind of classic strategy. You tie your opponent up on this side of the board, and then you switch to the king side. h4. And after that was taken, queen h6. What a killer. Beautiful finish. Two threats. Rook a8. And the king is caught on the back rank. And also queen g6. Of course, that pawn is pinned. And that's a clean knockout. There is no way out for Anton. And he resigned in that position. Beautiful finish. And another very nice finish, which had a very significant effect on the tournament standings. So Anish Giri playing against Radoslav Wojtaszek. And here, well, Giri has been pressing for the entire game. He had the white pieces. And here, Wojtaszek cracked. He's under a lot of pressure. He can still try to defend with rook f7, but instead he played bishop b2, overlooking Giri's threat. Rook takes pawn, and that was the final move of the game. If the rook is taken, rook d7 check, the king goes back, and it's mate. h7. You can switch it around as well and checkmate with a knight too, but that's basically the idea. So that meant that Anish Giri did a leapfrog of all the players on 6.5, and he has 7 out of 10 and takes the sole lead with 3 rounds to go. Thursday is a free day in Tata Steel. 3 rounds to go, incredibly tense. Thanks for watching.